Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. I actually don't need a microphone. You're very welcome tonight to our meeting, and thanks for coming out, seeing as how we have snow. As many of you will be aware, the Scottish Government have been introducing an ideology into our schools that should concern us all, telling children and young people that they've been born in the wrong body, or they may have a boy's body but a girl's brain because they don't fit sexist stereotypes, is not only dangerous, but it's scientifically illiterate. We know children are susceptible to influences, especially within the school environment, where teachers hold power and influence that can have a lifelong impact on young people. So it's a pleasure this evening for me to chair this meeting organised by the Soul Sisters, and I'm delighted that we have two esteemed speakers with expert knowledge in their chosen field. As we know, knowledge is power, and parents need to know what their children are being taught. The format for our meeting this evening, we'll hear from both speakers, and at the end we'll have a question and answer session, and we're aiming to finish by 9 o'clock. If you're going to tweet, could you please use the hashtag SoulSistersGRA, and it's SOLE. Thank you. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Shereen Benjamin. This is Shereen. Shereen is a senior lecturer in primary education at the University of Edinburgh with many years' experience in education and child development. Shereen is also an active member of the Labour Women's Declaration Working Group and was an active member of the University and College Union before she was forced out for her feminist materialist views. So without any further delay, I'm going to pass over to Shereen. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Are you okay with me sitting down, or would you rather I stood? No. Okay, so thanks very much. Thanks very much for asking me. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. What I'm going to do is a three-part talk. So I'm going to start off with a bit of explanation about the term, the way I use the term that Caroline's just used, gender identity ideology, because it's used in different ways by different people. So I'll just clarify what I mean when I say it. I'll then move on to the school curriculum and what's being taught in schools. If you're very good, I'll tell you a story. You've got to listen nicely. And then I'll go on to thinking about how schools and teachers are being encouraged to respond to gender non-conforming and transgender identifying children and young people. Okay? So to start with, gender identity ideology. This is a contested term. You'll hear words being used differently. But it's the phrase that, for me, conveys that this is a contested idea that is at the heart of a set of ideas that lead to a particular set of social practices. So the core belief of gender identity ideology is this belief that all individuals have an inner sense of maleness or femaleness, or both or neither, and that this inner sense of maleness or femaleness, which is your gender identity, a person's gender identity, is the only way, the sole way that they could be categorised as a man or a woman or something else. So in this reading, biological sex is largely irrelevant. Individuals can become aware of their gender identity according to this ideology at a very young age. They might be aware of it in early childhood. They might become aware of it in later adulthood, or at any time in between. And according to the ideology, it's possible for there to be a mismatch between a person's gender identity and the sex they've been born into. And where that happens, it's gender identity, that sense of maleness or femaleness or something else, that is the real authentic self, and only that person can know. Then that has to be affirmed and confirmed as reality. So there's no scientific basis for these claims. They're what we call unfalsifiable. They can't be disproved any more than any other subjective belief can be disproved. And people are at liberty to hold faith-based beliefs. You know, I don't have any issue with that at all. The issue comes when faith-based beliefs are taught in schools as if they're the only way to think and you can't ask questions about them. So what we do know about gender identity ideology is that it contradicts many long-established, well-evidenced facts about why biological sex is relevant, and that's obviously a subject for a bigger talk than this, but look on the Sex Matters website, if you're not already familiar with it, to see the many places where biological sex is relevant and why sex matters. But importantly here, another thing it contradicts with regard to children and adolescents is the findings from the past 70 years or so since childhood gender dysphoria was first identified, was first diagnosed. So childhood gender dysphoria is a diagnosis given to children who are profoundly distressed by aspects of their sex bodies and who are insistent, persistent, consistent, you've probably heard that formulation, that they are or should be of the opposite sex. And until recently, when I say recently, I mean the last 10 years in this country, a little bit longer in America. But until recently, it was a comparatively rare condition, and it affected mostly boys. It usually starts in early childhood, persists until adolescence, at which point for most children who've been diagnosed, it resolves naturally. And the figures do vary a bit, because there's different diagnostic protocols in different countries and different jurisdictions. But until recently, a kind of average is for about 80 to 85% of children diagnosed with childhood gender dysphoria, this thing that starts in early childhood. For about 80 to 85% of them, adolescence resolves it, puberty resolves it. So by the end of adolescence, these children have grown out of their gender dysphoria, it's resolved naturally. Significant proportions of them come out as lesbian or gay. So that's how it has been for the last 70 years or so. And I'll come back to this, but the important thing just to remember for the moment is that until recently, for most children, gender dysphoria has resolved during adolescence. That's the key point to remember. The other thing I want to note before I go on is that gender identity ideology contradicts most established feminist theorizing. So feminists like me have understood sex to be fixed, gender to be external and coercive. So sex is dimorphic, it's male-female, and it can't be changed, whereas gender is a set of cultural expectations and roles and norms that children learn and we go on learning through life. So for example, children learn early on that girls are expected to like pink and play with princesses, grow their hair long, go into any primary school at the moment, and you'll find almost every girl has very long hair. You know, children learn these stereotypical expectations. Boys learn that they're supposed to like football and supposed to be rowdy and have their hair very short. Those things are gender, they're social and cultural. And for feminists, your body makes you a woman or a man or a girl or a boy. But the feminist project has been to make it possible for women and men and girls and boys to behave as far as possible in whatever way they want, without these gendered expectations and stereotypes, not to be given the same opportunities, not to have to be corralled or boxed into making gender stereotypical choices. So gender identity ideology turns that on its head with a belief that if you're a boy and you like pink and you like princesses, maybe you're a girl. So let's go on to see what this looks like in the school curriculum. Should we have a story? Story time. Story time. Can I ask you to hold the mic just for a moment? Sure. Thank you. I am Jazz. This is the story of Jazz Jennings. I can tell that some of you have heard of Jazz Jennings, who is a reality TV star, now a young adult in America. So this book appears in the Scottish Government's guidance supporting transgender pupils in schools. I'm going to be coming back to that in a moment. So this book is recommended by the Scottish Government, and I'll read you a little bit of it. So Jazz in this book is looking back at Jazz's childhood, and it's narrated, just show the picture for those who can see it, it's narrated by what looks like a little girl of about 6 or 7. And I think the book is aimed at under 8s, I would say. So I'm sorry you can't see the pictures, maybe I'll be able to look at it afterwards. So I am Jazz. For as long as I can remember, my favourite colour has been pink. My second favourite colour is silver, and my third favourite colour is green. There's a picture of Jazz dressed as a fairy. Here are some of my other favourite things: dancing, singing, backflips, drawing, soccer, swimming, makeup, and pretending I'm a pop star. Most of all, I love mermaids. Sometimes I even wear a mermaid tail in the pool. My best friends are Samantha and Casey. We always have fun together. We like high heels and princess gowns or cartwheels or trampolines. But I'm not exactly like Samantha and Casey. I have a girl brain but a boy body. This is called transgender. I was born this way. When I was very little, my mum would say, "You're such a good boy." And I would say, "No, mama, good girl." And there's a picture of a toddler at this point. At first, my family was confused. They'd always thought of me as a boy. As I got a little older, I hardly ever played with trucks or tools or superheroes, only princesses and mermaid costumes. My brothers told me this was girl stuff. I kept right on playing. My sister says I was always talking to her about my girl thoughts and my girl dreams, and how one day I would be a beautiful lady. She would giggle and say, "You're a funny kid." Then one amazing day, everything changed. Mum and Dad took me to meet a new doctor who asked me lots and lots of questions. Afterwards, the doctor spoke to my parents, and I heard the word transgender for the first time. That night at bedtime, my parents both hugged me and said, "We understand now. Be who you are. We love you no matter what." This made me smile and smile and smile. Mum and Dad told me I could start wearing girl clothes to school and growing my hair long. They even let me change my name to Jazz. Being Jazz felt much more like being me, and there's a picture of a little girl doing cheerleading stuff with pom-poms. Mum said that being Jazz would make me different from the other kids at school, but that being different is okay. What's important, she said, is that I'm happy with who I am. Even today, there are kids who... So I'm missing out a few pages here about Jazz growing up. Even today, there are kids who tease me or call me by a boy name or ignore me altogether. This makes me feel crummy. Then I remember that the kids who get to know me usually want to be my friend. They say I'm one of the nicest girls at the school. I don't mind being different. Different is special. I think what matters most is what a person is like inside. I am Jazz. So, I think you can see from that how gender identity ideology is presented to children as truth. It's not presented as something that they can ask questions about and critique if they're seeing stereotypical images around them. So toddler boy Jazz in the book apparently knew his gender identity at an age when children don't understand the permanent nature of sex. A toddler doesn't understand what it is to be a boy or it is to be a girl. They don't understand that if you change your clothes, if you put on clothes identifying with the other sex, they think you change sex. That's a developmental stage. And the lines between fantasy and reality are blurry. Those of you who are parents will know that when children are very small, up until around the age of 6, that line between what's fantasy and what's real is blurred. So the narrator Jazz then tells small children who haven't yet developed that permanent conceptualization of sex or the ability to distinguish fantasy and reality, that it's possible to have a girl brain and a boy body, and that's presented as fact, when of course there's no scientific evidence that such a thing is possible. And the clear message at the end of the book, if you pick that up, is that it's mean or nasty to disbelieve or question anyone's stated gender identity. They have to be believed. It's only the mean kids who don't believe Jazz, because after all, according to gender identity ideology, they're speaking an authentic truth. What the book doesn't explain, beyond a few sexist stereotypes, is how a child's supposed to know what their gender identity is, other than that they like things that are stereotypically associated with boys and girls. I just want to read you a bit of another book called Who Are You? Only going to read a bit of this book. This is a story about you. The important thing to remember is that you are the one who knows you best. When babies are born, people ask, is it a boy or girl? And there's a picture of some puzzled-looking adults standing round looking at the Babies can't talk, so grown-ups make a guess by looking at their bodies. Behave yourselves, class. This is the sex assigned to you at birth, male or female. Sometimes people get this confused with gender, but gender's much more than the body you were born with. As babies grow into kids, they start to know what they like and don't like. And then there's a few pages of things that children might like, which are fine, they'd be good conversation starters. Kids know a lot about themselves. They know who they are by how they feel inside. This is your identity, who you feel like inside, who you know yourself to be. This can also change as you grow up or change from day to day. Your gender is one part of your identity, what makes you you. Some people say there are only two genders, but really there are many genders. You are who you say you are because you know you best. For some people, the grown-ups guessed right about their body and their gender. This is called cisgender, when someone's identity matches their sex assigned at birth. And for some people, there are more than just two choices. These are just a few words people use. Trans, genderqueer, non-binary, gender fluid, transgender, gender neutral, agender, neutral, bigender, third gender, two-spirit. And there are even more words people are using to describe their experience. This is called the gender spectrum. So again, this is a picture book for young children.
Is it also in Scottish?
It's not, but it is in some of the authority guides. It's not in the Scottish Government one. But in that book, what you can see is that children are being introduced to more of the language associated with gender identity ideology. And this is something that I see in schools a lot. I go into a lot of schools, and I see the language used. There's now often a notice board of LGBT equality will be there, and the definitions that are given of gender identity are always about somebody whose transgender. Trans is somebody whose gender identity doesn't match the sex they were assigned at birth. I routinely see that language being used in primary schools. And I think it's a really confusing message to give to children. I don't know what children are supposed to make of those books. What I don't think we know this at all yet, how widespread these recommended resources are, or how many primary schools are teaching children gender identity in that kind of depth. I see the language being used. I actually don't know how in-depth that coverage is. I think it varies a lot from school to school, depending on the makeup of the school. I can see your hand going up.
Yeah, it was just that my grandson came back, his teacher's pregnant, and she just not long got married, so she went from Miss to Mrs. in her own admission, but she's standing in front of them talking about being a pregnant person. And I was just like, oh my God, and I don't know how to deal with it, what to say.
Assigning sex.
Yeah.
Assigning sex, that's my son.
Can we deal with those questions and comments at the end, please? Sorry. Yeah, it's just, I think Shereen's still got a fair bit to get to share with us.
That's a really helpful point, thank you for that. So I've talked a bit about what's happening in primary schools. In secondary schools, what I'm seeing is what you would normally expect with an ideology that's new and that is being promoted heavily on the internet. Young people will be coming across a lot of videos glamorizing anything to do with transgender identities on TikTok and YouTube. There are hundreds of these videos. You would normally expect a secondary school to be covering that in a way that enables young people to engage critically with that kind of material. And that's what we're not seeing, or I'm certainly not seeing it in secondary schools, and I'm not seeing it recommended in the Scottish Government resources. I do want to go on to how schools are responding to gender non-conforming and transgender identifying young people, if I may. And a bit earlier, I said that for about 80% of children diagnosed with gender dysphoria, that distress with their sex bodies resolved during puberty. And until recently, I think most people in this room probably know, the recommended approach for these children was called watchful waiting, which meant supporting the child, affirming that their feelings are painful. If a child is struggling and saying, I should be a girl, I'm a boy, but I feel really uncomfortable, of course you would treat that child with understanding and sympathy, but recognise that they're going through something painful, try and work out what you can do to support them, and reassure them that for most children, they grow out of it. So that's what was recommended until very recently. But in the past 10 years or so, and speeding up dramatically in the last 5 years, there have been two very significant changes. So the first significant change, I think, is that as gender identity ideology has become more and more popular and fashionable, the numbers of children who believe themselves to be of the opposite sex, or both sexes, or no sex at all, has massively increased. And that's true in the younger age group, the group that have traditionally presented with gender dysphoria, but it's most evident in adolescents, and especially adolescent girls. So until this last decade, gender dysphoria among adolescent girls was almost unknown. Whereas I never came across it in years of teaching in secondary schools and then doing teacher education. You would never come across it. But now every secondary school you go into has at least one or two girls asserting a transgender identity or a non-binary identity. And in some schools there's very significant numbers of such girls. And in 2018, an American social psychologist called Lisa Lippman coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria, ROGD, you might have heard of it, which describes the social phenomenon of teenagers, especially girls, identifying as trans. Now, just to be clear, that's not a new diagnosis. ROGD isn't a new type of gender dysphoria, it's a description of a social phenomenon. And it refers to gender dysphoria that presents very quickly and intensely, and usually, she says, after an extended period of time spent engaging online. So it's very different from childhood gender dysphoria, which is a slow burn, comes on from early childhood and remains that way. So the thing to emphasise here is this is a new cohort, an entirely new cohort of adolescent girls developing the belief that they're of the opposite sex or no sex at all. So childhood gender dysphoria, which I spoke about before, until this last decade was very rare, mostly boys, typically persistent to adolescence. ROGD, the new social phenomenon, has seen numbers shooting up from about 2012, mostly among girls during puberty or post-puberty. That's an extraordinary change in a demographic, for something that was unknown in a demographic to now be presenting so widely. That's an extraordinary change. And not only that, it's especially prevalent among girls experiencing other forms of distress. So some stats that are taken from Dr. Lippman's study, in the group of girls she was looking at, 45% had a history of self-harm prior to their diagnosis of gender dysphoria. 48% had experienced a traumatic event prior to presenting with gender dysphoria, so that could be an abuse event or a family breakdown. And 63% had other diagnoses, such as psychiatric disorders or neurodevelopmental disabilities, such as autism. So there's a lot going on with these girls, in addition to feeling profoundly uncomfortable with the sexist stereotypes that surround them and having discomfort growing into a woman. And the psychotherapist Stella O'Malley has described this as a very vulnerable group. You can see it is from those stats. Many of these girls have difficulties fitting in socially, which can mean that when you go online and you're presented with the idea that all your problems are because you've been born in the wrong body, and you could be a new person, start all over again by claiming a trans identity, that's a desperately attractive idea to a girl who's struggling with all those other problems which are disproportionately presenting in this group, with problems fitting in, finding your tribe. If somebody says to you, we'll be your tribe, you can fit in with us, it's a desperately attractive thing. O'Malley describes the stages that girls typically go through from when they first encounter gender identity online through to developing a typically very firm, unshakable belief in their transgender identification. And I don't have time to go into that, it's really interesting. If you look on the website of an organisation called GenSpect, there's a really good webinar, it was a full day webinar where they looked at ROGD. So if you're interested in that, I thoroughly recommend going online, looking on the GenSpect website. Now, I'm not saying the girls' feelings aren't real, I think they are. But we need to question how they've arrived at what rapidly become these very strong and unshakable beliefs. And certainly the emergence of a new cohort should be prompting us to ask questions. But however they've arrived at those beliefs, it is a fact on the ground for schools and teachers. There are growing numbers of children and young people in schools presenting with gender dysphoria or with a trans identity, especially this new cohort of adolescent girls. So schools and teachers do need advice on how to respond. So last August 2021, the Scottish Government issued its own guidance supporting transgender pupils in schools. It did actually turn out to be a very slightly amended version of the 2019 guidance that was produced by LGBT Youth Scotland. It's not very different from that, and that guidance was withdrawn because there were concerns about it being unlawful in places and inappropriate in others. The first thing to draw your attention to is its title, Supporting Transgender Pupils in Schools. And you may have noticed that I've been very careful this evening. I've referred to children and adolescents with gender dysphoria, or children and adolescents who believe themselves to be of the opposite sex. There's a good reason I do that. When it comes to younger children, we don't know and we can't know which of the children experiencing gender dysphoria will find it resolves during puberty, which ones are going to be in the 80 to 85% where it resolves, and which ones are going to be in the 15 to 20% for whom gender dysphoria is a lifelong condition that they may need to live and present as the opposite sex. We don't know with young children which of those groups they're going to be in. And when it comes to adolescents, there's so much we don't know in relation to this sudden, very significant increase in numbers. So we've got to, at the very least, be open-minded to a variety of psychological and social factors, social media activity, peer pressure, social contagion, and the difficulties of being an adolescent girl growing up in our misogynist, porn-soaked culture. So ROGD is a very new phenomenon. We don't know for which of those girls it'll be a developmental stage in a specific cultural context that is feeding a particular belief. So I think most people in this audience probably know that in England, the Westminster government has commissioned a major review into what's happening in gender identity services for children and young people. It's headed by Hilary Cass, so it's known as the Cass Review. And their interim findings, which were published last month, pointed out the lack of evidence about history and treatment and outcomes, and in particular to in relation to the ROGD group. But in gender identity ideology, this thing that's being taught, that teachers are told to teach on critically in schools, there's no room for uncertainty or for questions, because according to gender ideology, there's only one possible explanation for a school pupil experiencing gender dysphoria, or coming to the belief that they're of the opposite sex, and that's that they are transgender. It's a wired-in thing about them, and that their gender identity is their true, authentic self and must be confirmed as such. So if you use the term transgender pupil, as the Scottish Government is doing in this guidance, you're accepting the ideological belief that a child's belief they're of the opposite sex is a true, authentic representation of their real self, and you're ruling out other explanations. You're ignoring the established fact that children and adolescents experiment with their identities and go through distinct developmental stages when their beliefs about who they are likely to change quite radically. You're ignoring the desistance rate for young children, that 80 to 85% desistance rate. I find when I say that to teachers, they really start to think differently about the children in front of them. So from its title alone, Supporting Transgender Pupils in Schools, we know the Scottish Government's guidance is ideologically framed. So thinking about what it advises teachers to do, it has got some good advice in it. I wouldn't want to kid you on otherwise. There's some good things in it. So in the section on recognising gender identity, it starts off, and I'm quoting now, if a young person in the school says they now want to live as a boy, although their sex assigned at birth was female, or they now want to live as a girl, although their sex assigned at birth was male, it's important to provide support and listen to what they're saying. Well, apart from that phrase, sex assigned at birth, which I think is incorrect and ideological, I actually agree with the advice there. Provide support and listen. I think that is good advice. That is what I would want schools and teachers to be doing. So here's how it goes on. If a young person would like changes to be made in order that they're best supported to learn, then consider what's in the best interests of the young person. And again, I really agree with that. The child or young person's best interests have to be paramount. But how are teachers to know these best interests? Are they told that most primary school age children with gender dysphoria, even those who are most insistent with it, grow out of it during puberty? No, they're not told that. Are they told that ROGD is a complex social phenomenon, poorly understood at the moment, affecting some of the most vulnerable teenage girls? No, they're not told that. Here's where it goes. I'm quoting again. If a young person comes out to you, it's important not to deny their identity or to overly question their understanding of their gender identity. So in other words, You can't encourage them to reflect on how they've come to their beliefs, which would be completely normal and best practice in any other context that I'm aware of. Going back to quoting. Ask what name and pronoun you should use to address them. Using the correct pronouns, by which it means the pronoun the pupil has requested, is the right and respectful approach to including transgender young people. Staff and young people should avoid misgendering a transgender young person, and so on. This isn't age differentiated, by the way, so this is the advice for children all the way through schooling. Now, the practice of changing a child's name to one associated with the opposite sex and using pronouns of the opposite sex or of no sex at all is part of what's known as social transition. So the practice of treating a child or a young person as if they're of the opposite sex. And it may sound simple, and the guidance present it as something that schools and teachers should and indeed must do if a child requests it, because it's the only kind way to respond. But in reality, it's a major psychosocial intervention. If you treat a child as if they're of the opposite sex or no sex, in a context in which you're also teaching gender identity ideology as truth, then social transition in that context means you're confirming a child's fantasy that they are and can be of the opposite sex. And again, because this is also new, we don't know the long-term effects of socially transitioning children, but there's already evidence from North America, which is a few years ahead of us, that socially transitioning young children makes it less likely that their gender dysphoria will resolve with puberty. And going back to the Cass review, which I talked about a moment ago, they said, and I quote, "It is important to view social transition as an active intervention because it may have significant effects on the child or young person in terms of their psychological functioning. Whatever position one takes, it is important to acknowledge that it is not a neutral act and better information is needed about outcomes." That's the interim report of the Cass review. So in other words, it's at least possible, and there's a lot we don't know, but it's at least possible that if you confirm a child's fantasy that they're really of the opposite sex, you make it harder for their distress around their sex body to resolve as they mature. And does this matter? Well, yes, it does for all sorts of reasons, not least because it could be putting children on a trajectory towards major surgical interventions in their late teens, such as double mastectomies of healthy breasts for girls, very significant lifelong hormone treatment. So by socially transitioning these children in school, we're quite possibly, I'm not saying we are doing this, but we have to be open to the possibility that we are, because we don't have enough good data at the moment. We're quite possibly setting them up for becoming lifelong medical patients. When left to the previous watchful waiting approach, most would have grown into adults who could live comfortably in their sexed bodies. And yet, in the absence of evidence to support the practice of social transition, in the absence of good information about outcomes, so it's experimental still, and in the absence of medical and psychological training for teachers, the Scottish Government and the lobby groups who may also be advising schools are telling teachers that social transition is the only progressive, inclusive way to respond to pupils who assert a transgender identity. And as I said before, we don't know the extent of the reach of gender identity ideology in schools. The guidance isn't statutory. The Scottish Government guidance is not a requirement for schools. Head teachers have discretion over whether they use it or not, but because this is such a new area and people are frightened about doing things wrong, a lot of head teachers, in my experience, are using it and are relying on it. I don't know how many people in this room are parents or are friends with parents of young children who are concerned with what's going on in schools. If you are, my suggestion to you is that you ask your children's head teachers some specific questions. You can ask them whether they use the Scottish Government guidance. Large numbers are relying on it, as far as I can tell. You can ask whether the schools had training on gender identity. That might be workshops for staff, might be workshops for pupils, from any of the lobby groups, because lobby groups, I'm seeing them in many schools. LGBT Youth Scotland, Stonewall Scotland, Scottish Trans Alliance. So you can ask at your child's school whether those groups are going in. And if they are, ask to see the materials. They might not be awful, because there's been what we call forced teaming. So it could be that there's some materials that are being used which, say, have positive images of same-sex parents. We would want that. You know, there are things we would want to happen. There might be resources being used which question gender stereotypes. We would want that to happen. So don't assume that whatever's happening is bad, but see if you can have a conversation with your head teacher or your child's head teacher based on the resources they are using. If this is all new and confusing, I think a lot of people in this room are very aware of the terrain, but some people may be less so. There are some really good sources on the internet. I recommend Transgender Trend. One of their booklets is over there. Transgender Trend have guidance for schools, which you can download and give to your school's head teacher as the basis for a conversation. There's another organisation, Safe Schools Alliance, which also has some really good materials for schools. I'm aware of time. I haven't gone on to the GRA, but that's another ball game that we can come to in the questions. I think I'll leave it there because I've been talking for quite a long time already. Thanks very much.